Good morning, everybody. It's good to see you this morning. Thanks for coming for this time of Bible study. We're studying a series of lessons in this Sunday morning class called Rules to Live By. I think we've talked about a lot of really practical concepts that are useful in everyday living, and that's the idea, rules to live by. If you're looking at the study guide, we're on lesson 9 this morning. If you don't have that, don't worry, you'll be able to follow along. This is sort of a familiar statement that actually Jesus said, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." Now that's some of the statements we've made have sort of been chimney corner scripture, but this is actually from the scripture. Let him who is without sin cast the first stone. The problem is that text is very commonly misused and abused. So let's say I'm doing some really pretty bad stuff. You know, I'm out there. I'm not behaving morally. I'm in pretty bad shape, and you come to me and try to straighten me out, and the idea is, oh, you think you're so good? You're so perfect? You know, you think you can correct me? Jesus said, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." You think you're without sin? You come to me, you try to correct me, you think you're without sin? Isn't that the way that this text is often misused? The way a person would try to justify himself by saying, Jesus said, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." So that's what we want. That's what we want to address in this study this morning. That is obviously an abuse and a misuse and never what Jesus intended. Of course, he said this, and we're going to get to the text that covers this. We're going to look at it quite thoroughly. It's in John 8. But before we get to John 8, the author asks us to do just a little bit of background reviewing about the Pharisees. The Pharisees are the ones who came to Jesus. The Pharisees are the ones to whom Jesus said, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." So what about these Pharisees? What kind of people were they? Well, look in Matthew 23. Matthew 23, beginning verse 1. "Then spake Jesus to the multitude and to his disciples, saying, The scribes and Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. All therefore whatsoever they bid you observe, that observe and do. But do not ye after their works, for they say and do not. For they bind heavy burdens and grievous to be borne, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers." Okay, so here's how Jesus described these Pharisees. These Pharisees are the ones we're going to be dealing with in regards to this expression. But these Pharisees, they say and do not. In other words, they would tell you what to do, and they don't do it themselves. We see a lot of that in our world today. Right? Even in politics in our day, there's this expression, "Rules for thee, but not for me." In other words, we want you to do this, but I'm not going to do what I'm telling you to do. Well, that's not a new thing. And the Pharisees in Jesus' day were experts at that. Say and do not. They put heavy burdens on others. They won't lift a thing themselves. He says in verse 4. And so the Pharisees, pretty bad people, really. You know, as you remember studying through the life of Jesus, undoubtedly the Pharisees received the strongest condemnations of anybody. I mean, Jesus dealt with everybody. He dealt with tax collectors. He dealt with prostitutes. He dealt with all kinds of people who had moral issues, and he never condoned any of that, obviously. But it's interesting that I think the people who received his strongest rebukes were these Pharisees who were so hypocritical. So that's something certainly to keep in mind. Tom?
There in 23, important to notice that he talks about the things that they sit in the seat. They were where they had the authority to talk about the things that they talked about. And when it regarded to God's word, Jesus told the people and his disciples, follow that, do that.
Yeah.
But when you look at them and you observe their deeds that they're doing, they're not doing that. Don't follow that.
Don't follow their example.
And that sort of holds the principle. If it's according to God's word, you have no excuse. You need to do it.
So if you tell me something to do that's from the Word of God, it doesn't matter whether I like you or not.
Right.
If it's from the Word of God, I need to be doing it. But people today don't look at it that way. Exactly. All right. Now, still sort of background information about the Pharisees. Look at Matthew 12. I want to spend just a minute with this text. We've studied it before, but I do think this will get thrown up to us from time to time. Let's read Matthew 12, beginning at verse 1. At that time Jesus went on the Sabbath day through the corn, and his disciples were a-hungered and began to pluck the ears of corn and to eat. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said to them, Behold, thy disciples do that which is not lawful to do on the Sabbath day. But he said to them, Have you not read that which David did when he was hungered, and they that were with him, how he entered into the house of God and did eat the showbread which was not lawful for him to eat, neither for them that were with him, but only for the priest? Or have you not read in the law how that on Sabbath days the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? But I say to you that in this place is one greater than the temple. But if ye had known what this meaneth, I will have mercy and not sacrifice, ye would not have condemned the guiltless, for the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath day. Okay, I hope you recognize that text. We've studied it before. This is a text that is most often used to justify situation ethics. So the idea is usually this particular practice, whatever it may be, usually this particular practice is wrong. But under extreme circumstances, you can break that rule and do it. Situation ethics, that the ethics or the right and wrong of a thing is determined by the situation or the circumstances that you're in. That's really a popular idea in the world. I don't know how many people would actually identify it by that nomenclature, situation ethics, but it's a very common idea. I usually don't lie, but if I'm in a pinch, I might tell a lie to get out of a bind. Or I might tell a lie to protect the feelings of a friend or a family relative. I usually don't lie, but in a particular situation, I might have to tell a little lie. That is such a common idea. I think a lot of us still like to watch the old Andy Griffith shows. I'm going to tell you, there was a lot of situations going on in Andy Griffith. Andy lied a lot to protect Barney's feelings. So that's a very popular idea. And this text is the one that's most often misused. And the Pharisees were involved here, so that's why our author asked us to look at this text. Real quickly, first of all, and you might want to know, I've got this written in the margin of my text here, Deuteronomy 23:25. It wasn't, I think your first reaction when they're going through a man's field and taking of his crops and eating them, they were stealing. But actually, Deuteronomy 23:25 allowed that. That was not stealing. That was allowed in the law of Moses. So the Pharisees weren't criticizing Jesus' disciples for stealing, because they weren't stealing. What they were doing, you couldn't take a blade and start harvesting a man's field. But if you went through it, and by the way, this corn, they didn't have corn like our corn back then. This is probably wheat. And so they grab a head of wheat, rub it in their hands, and get the seeds, and then eat the seeds. And that was allowed. You couldn't put a sickle to a man's field and start harvesting that way, but you could walk through the field and grab a handful, and that was allowed. Deuteronomy 23:25. So take that off the table. They weren't arguing that the disciples were stealing. What they were arguing was that they were violating the Sabbath day, that they were doing work on the Sabbath day. The idea of plucking an ear and rubbing it in your hands to these Pharisees was a violation of the specific law, no work on the Sabbath day. Notice at the end of verse 2, thy disciples do that which is not lawful to do upon the Sabbath day. That was their criticism. In this text, the way that you have to explain this text, Jesus wasn't justifying situation ethics. Jesus was saying that he understood the law of the Sabbath very well. Verse 8, the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath day. Jesus was saying, I know the Sabbath law. I wrote the Sabbath law. You're not teaching me about the Sabbath law. I'm there. Notice, he says, if they understood, they would not, end of verse 7, if they had understood mercy and not sacrifice, ye would not have condemned the guiltless. So underline that. Jesus said his disciples were guiltless. Right? But the big question is, what about David? What about the example of David entering into the synagogue? At that time it was the tabernacle. He entered into the tabernacle. He was fleeing from Saul. Saul was trying to kill him. And he and a band of men were on the run. And they came to the place where the tabernacle was erected at that point in time. And there wasn't anything there provision-wise. And so he asked the priest, and that priest wrongly gave him the showbread, the showbread that was on display in the holy place of the tabernacle. They changed that out on a regular basis. And so he ate of that showbread. Only the priests were allowed to eat showbread. David wasn't a priest. He wasn't of the tribe of Levi. He was the tribe of Judah. And it wasn't, notice, Jesus said in verse 4, he did eat the showbread which was not lawful for him to eat, neither for them that are with him. So what is the point Jesus is making here? The point is that the Jews, the Pharisees, dismissed what David was their national hero. David is all good. Everything about David is good. And Jesus is calling out the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. You wave off what David did because he's your guy. He was guilty. It's not lawful. No, underline, not lawful. It was not lawful for him to eat that showbread. You ignore that. And then you come over here and condemn my disciples who are guiltless. So the explanation of this text is just that. The hypocrisy of the Pharisees. Excuse David, their hero, criticize the disciples of Jesus who hadn't done anything wrong. That's the kind of hypocrisy they were guilty of. Okay? Tom?
Also, they feel about priests who serve on the Sabbath day. They do it, according to the strict vision of the law, that they weren't allowed to do any work. But the priests had an exemption from that.
Yeah.
And they were exempt. And Jesus said they were innocent.
Yeah.
Right? In the same way, he's sort of making a contrast about showing that, actually diffusing a little bit from David doing something wrong to the priest that did, what for everybody else was wrong, but was innocent for them to do. And here the disciples, he's making that point, that they were innocent of doing that.
And again, Jesus said, I know the Sabbath law.
Yeah.
I'm the author of the Sabbath law. You're not going to tell me about what's right and wrong from the Sabbath. Thomas?
I'm not sure if y'all went over this verse and chapter, but Numbers 15, verse 32 and below, talks about a guy that picked up sticks on the Sabbath,
yeah.
Yes, and
Yeah.
he was killed for it,
Yeah.
stoned for it.
Yeah.
What would you say to that versus this? What's the difference from picking up wheat versus that?
I would argue that you're allowed to eat on the Sabbath day. And so Jesus perfectly interpreted the law, and this was not a sin, that was. So, what is that? Yeah, go ahead, Thomas.
Six, it was, wrong topic.
No, go ahead.
With the six, it was actually work that was being done because he was doing something that he should have done that the day before, made preparation for that. Here, it's like, okay, eat, theoretically, I guess you pick it up and put it down. That's work. So should you be not eating on the Sabbath day? And I think Jesus is showing that, there's a difference between work and this type of thing.
And eating.
They had a right to go a certain distance on the Sabbath day, so it wasn't wrong for them to be out walking on the Sabbath day. They weren't condemning them for that because they knew this restriction there. They were taking that
Yeah.
and making
Yeah.
a play on that.
Thomas?
Yeah, I was going to say exactly what you said. There's a difference between working and eating. Work means to labor, and that's the thing that people forget. is that wasn't laboring what you were saying. It's
Yeah.
just picking up food.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
nothing wrong with that. So
Yeah.
I agree with you.
I think that's the big difference, yeah. Wayne, did you have a thought? Okay. All right. Now, all of that we've probably spent too much time on, but all of that is sort of background to this particular episode in John 8, where Jesus used that expression, let him who is without sin cast the first stone. So let's go there. John 8, beginning verse 2. John 8, verse 2. Early in the morning he came again to the temple, and all the people came unto him, and he sat down and taught them. And the scribes and Pharisees, okay, these are the guys, right? That's what our background was with. The scribes and Pharisees brought unto him a woman taken in adultery. And when they had set her in the midst, they say unto him, Master, this woman was taken in adultery, in the very act. Now Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned. But what sayest thou? This they said, tempting him, that they might have to accuse him. But Jesus stooped down and with his finger wrote on the ground as though he heard them not. And when they continued asking him, he lifted up himself and said unto them, He that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her. And again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. And when they heard it, being convicted by their own conscience, went out one by one, beginning at the eldest, even to the last. And Jesus was left alone, and the woman standing in the midst. When Jesus had lifted up himself and saw none but the woman, he said to her, Woman, where are those thine accusers? Hath no man condemned thee? She said, No man, Lord. And Jesus said to her, Neither do I condemn thee. Go and sin no more. Okay, as we said earlier, this is a text that often gets abused and misused by sinners who don't want anybody saying anything about their sin. You know, you can't, before you can approach me, you've got to be sinless. If you, don't be trying to correct me unless you are without sin. You're not without sin, are you? Okay then. So if you acknowledge that you have sinned, then don't be coming to me and trying to correct me. That's the idea. That's the way this is misused. All right. I thought it was interesting that our author gave us a multiple choice question. He hadn't done that in any of these lessons. So after reading this, did the accusers bring the woman to Jesus to justify her, to avenge her husband because they respected his opinion about such matters, or did they bring her to him to test and corner him? Well, obviously the last is the right answer. Verse 6, this they said, tempting him that they might have to accuse him. So they weren't worried about this woman. They weren't worried about her life situation, her marriage situation. They weren't interested in getting his judgment on how to deal with the situation. They just wanted to entrap him. But that's mentioned several times, right, in the life of Jesus. Again, it goes to their hypocrisy. It goes absolutely to the hypocrisy of the Pharisees that we were describing earlier. All right, the next question, was there any doubt about her guilt? What do you think? Any doubt about her guilt? Tom?
From the information they given, no.
I think probably not.
They caught her in the very act.
Yeah, I think there's probably not. I mean, there's probably not any doubt that she was a guilty, sinful person, and probably had in fact been engaged in the sin of adultery. I don't think there's probably much doubt about that. Thomas?
So my other question, say it, you know, they saw him after everything. Why would it be against Jesus to say stone or, you know, get rid of her or anything? Because in the old law it says you stone them.
Yeah, let's hang on that. Let's talk about that in a minute. There's some things wrong with this, though. There's some things wrong with the situation. Okay, part of what's wrong with the situation is she's caught in the very act. Where's the man? Right? Where's the man who was engaged in adultery with this woman? If she's caught in the very act, he's there too, right? So she's probably a sinful woman. She may have been caught in the act, but if she was, why didn't they bring the man as well? Now let's go to the Old Testament text that pertains to this that Thomas was asking about. Leviticus chapter 20, verse 10. Leviticus 20, verse 10. The man that committeth adultery with another man's wife, even he that committeth adultery with his neighbor's wife, the adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death. So something's missing here, right? So in this situation where's the other guilty party? They're not following the law here. Go to Deuteronomy 17:7. Deuteronomy 17:7. The hands of the witnesses shall be first upon him to put him to death, and afterward the hands of all the people, so shalt thou put evil away from among the people. That's talking about witnesses to any sinful thing. Go back to verse 6. At the mouth of 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses shall he that is worthy of death be put to death, but at the mouth of 1 witness he shall not be put to death. So, again, this may have been lacking in this situation. The woman was brought, they found out about this situation, but they may not have been firsthand witnesses in regards to what the woman had been doing. So, to the question that Thomas asked, can you think of, and I searched, can you think of any biblical example where someone was actually stoned for adultery? I can't find one. David was guilty of adultery, right? But he wasn't stoned. I can't think of an example. I'm not doubting that the law was very specific on that, but I'm wondering if the fact that we don't have recorded instances of it suggests that this was a rule of law that had a high bar that you had to pass in order to affect that sentence. In other words, the law is clear on that, right? But in regards to the testimony of multiple witnesses to prove this crime or sin, pretty high bar. And I'm wondering, I don't know, I'm just speculating that maybe the reason why we don't have recorded instances, because you know, of course, surely adultery happened many times. As I said, we have the recorded example of David and Bathsheba, very plain. But I'm just wondering if the proof test is so high here that it made it pretty hard to ever implement the punishment in specific cases. Tom?
Did it indicate that the witnesses that caught them were the ones who stoned first, and then the rest of the congregation joined in, and all people participated?
Well, here in Deuteronomy 17:7, the hand of the witnesses shall be first upon him to put him to death. So you had to be a first-hand witness to begin that process. Yeah. Wayne?
Plus, in Deuteronomy 22:22, he says at the end of that chapter, or at the end of that verse, he says, "Thus you shall purge the evil from Israel." They weren't purging the evil from Israel. They were adding on to the evil in Israel by bringing someone who they obeyed half of what the law demanded.
Yeah.
So they weren't purging the evil
Yeah.
out of Israel. They were just adding to it.
I think you're right. This would have been actually a violation of the process and the rules. I think you're right. Okay. All right. Yes.
Our law is pretty strict sometimes. I mean, picking up sticks on Sabbath, maybe a child that won't behave, the parents, they just don't. It's just, it's strange that don't have that recording of the adultery situation.
Yeah, it is. But again, I wonder if it's because, it's a pretty high bar to pass to be able to enforce.
Did she pass that bar? Were you in that situation to meet that burden of proof?
Well, but do you trust what they said about it? They apparently...
She did deny it. Her response
yeah.
when he asked where your accusers,
Yeah.
that would have been a great opportunity for her to say, well, it's false, so it didn't happen.
Yeah. She did. That's right. She did. That's right. True. Tom?
And Jesus asked him that question of, making that statement to him about that, you without sin cast the first stone. A lot of us take and look at it as, well, I got to evaluate myself and whether I have sin. I think it's being pretty specific. In this situation, if you're without sin, you cast the first stone. Well, these are scribes and Pharisees, knew the law. We've gone back to show a lot.
They actually believed they were blameless.
They know the law, but they violated the law. So in that essence, They had sinned in doing so.
I think that's the key. I think that they realize that Jesus is calling them out for not properly following the process here. I
I
think,
think that's why in the other place where he brings out David and he shows the contrast between two situations. One was unlawful. Both of them did an act that in the general situation was unlawful. One of them, it was unlawful. They should have punished him for it. The other one, the priests had a right to go through and do it. Knowing law, you would have known that they had that because they had to go through, perform the services on the Sabbath day. That gave them that exemption. Here, when they brought him before Jesus, they violated several different things. One, they didn't have both, they didn't have both of individuals there.
yeah.
They didn't have the witness, maybe didn't have the witnesses there with them. And then they're bringing it to a third party to get his approval to do
Yeah.
it.
So the next question actually goes to that, Tom. If the accusers were really supporters of Moses' law, what should they have done instead of coming to Jesus? Carry out the sentence. Jesus doesn't have to be involved at all. And so their motives are on display. J.D.?
Yeah, I was just going to say, you're talking about it being a high bar. I mean, if you think about something of this nature, it would probably be pretty hard to have 2 to 3 eyewitnesses to the specific thing.
Yeah.
Because it sounds like, if you read the law as it is, and it's very specific, it seems that even if essentially you committed adultery and you walked out and told somebody, I just committed adultery, they weren't an eyewitness. And you may have told them that you did it, but they weren't an eyewitness to see you.
And I was thinking about David and Bathsheba. Actual eyewitnesses, the inspired text tells us that he was definitely guilty.
Right.
Were there any physical eyewitnesses of his sin? Probably not. They may have seen the woman come and the woman go, but they didn't see the act. And so and that might go partially to the reason why David was excused in that. Mike?
When they said, look, he was saying cast a stone. It wasn't.
He
He was just saying, if you accuse her, go ahead and cast a stone. He wasn't saying you don't cast a stone. He was just saying, hey, but now, he wanted mercy. The Lord desires His mercy. He's desired it all throughout the whole Bible. He's desired mercy. But according to the law, he was saying, look, it's according to the law. Go ahead and cast your stone.
I think that's really...
He was saying, look, hey, take a look at yourself. And there's another thing. You can commit this adultery in your mind.
Yeah.
And he was saying, look, we could all be in here guilty of adultery. Of course, nobody's going to admit to it, but the Lord on high will know about it.
I think you make a really important point, Mike. Jesus was not telling them, ignore the law. He was not saying, doesn't matter what the law says. Forget it. He never did that. That's a really important point of this. J.D.?
Yeah, as was pointed out earlier, the law says it was up to them to carry out the punishment, the eyewitnesses, essentially.
Yeah.
If they were an eyewitness and they had 2 or 3 together and they all established that this happened, it wasn't up to Jesus to give them permission. It was up to them to carry out the law.
Exactly.
That's
Exactly.
an
Tom?
incredibly hard thing to have to do.
Oh, for sure.
Having to make those decisions, sends ammunition downrange. You just can't imagine how difficult it is to know that you're taking lethal action
Yeah.
against the view.
Yeah.
And to think that
I have to think, though, Paul, in this case, these Pharisees were so hard-hearted. I'm not sure that they would...
But I'm saying that, just 3 common people see something happen.
Yeah. I know what you're saying.
And the whole neighborhood has to come around and do this.
Yeah.
And they know these people. This is a bad situation.
Yeah, I agree. Thomas?
So I got 3 things. One thing is, going back to my first point onto it, I might have lost you at one point, but it still isn't wrong for Jesus to say stone, correct?
It's the law. Yeah.
It's the law. The other thing too would be when it talks about, it says, he who without sin among you, let him throw a stone at her first. So he's not saying throw the stone or whatever, or you should do it, and saying that it's okay or whatever. he's saying if you're out without sin. So for one thing is, why is he saying that? You know? Why
Well, let me address that right there.
Yeah.
I think that he who is without sin, I think that Jesus is saying sin in this matter. He who is without sin in regards to this that you're doing right now. They were guilty of sin in the way they had brought this matter forward. I don't think he's saying you would have to be a completely sinless person to ever carry out capital punishment under the law of Moses. That was not the case. So I don't think Jesus is saying, well, if you're a perfect person in your life and have never sinned, okay, throw a stone. I don't think he's saying that. I think he's saying if you're without sin in regards to this particular episode and what you're doing right here, and notice it says they were convicted in their conscience. They knew what they were up to. They knew the hypocrisy that they were guilty of. So I think, though, without sin is in that more narrow window. And then you had one other point.
Well, but also to go back to that, I get what you're saying, and I think that could be the case too. But the thing is that we don't have any proof that that is the case. That's just us thinking that it could be.
Well, the thing of it is,
Clarify at all.
right, but the thing of it is, we know that the law of Moses did not require that. In other words, if I caught you, I could stone you. If I was the eyewitness, I could throw that first. I'm supposed to, according to Deuteronomy, I'm supposed to throw the first stone. And if I caught you, I could do that, even though I'm not a perfect person. The law of Moses never required that in order to carry out capital punishment, the ones who carry it out must be sinless themselves. I think Jesus is talking about this episode.
Well, and the other reason why I say it too is because I've had people go back to this verse and saying sin is the same. It's not just, okay, you lie and you commit adultery. There's still sin. It's still equal to the same.
Yeah.
One has a greater effect on other people, of course.
Yeah.
But the thing is, it's still sin. And I've seen people go back to this verse saying, hey, that kind of proves it. But I can see that way, but also too, I see what you're saying too.
Okay. JD?
Yeah, I mean, I think in this whole thing, people just try to lift this completely out of context. I think what you're saying, the most narrow, interpretation is usually the best. And here I think all he's saying is what the law of Moses required. If you have followed that process and you've followed the law of Moses, then go ahead and do it.
Yeah.
But he's also kind of not out loud saying, but I know you haven't.
Yeah.
And you ought to think about that.
Yeah, he knew their hearts for sure.
And it calls to, in my mind, in the New Testament, judge not that you be not judged. Does that mean you're never supposed to judge anybody? No, but it also means that if you're like one of those people in that situation, you better make sure
Don't
that
judge
you're using
hypocritically.
righteous judgment. Because how would you like to be in that woman's situation where somebody railroaded you?
Yeah. Real quickly, before we run out of time, what was Jesus doing on the dirt with the dirt business? Any thoughts on that? What was Jesus doing writing in the dirt, Thomas?
I think that's just to confuse them. I think it's the strategy of just give me time, and let me think about this before I...
Yeah, we don't. The answer to that is we don't know what he was doing. But I've read a lot of commentators who want to speculate. Of course, mark this total speculation because nobody knows. But I've read commentators who say that he was writing their sins on the dirt. Lying, stealing, hypocrisy. That would be interesting and you couldn't prove that if your life depended on it, but it'd be interesting to think about it that way. Again, question 8, did Jesus contradict or tell them to just ignore the law of Moses? Absolutely not. But what he was doing was exposing their hypocrisy. Tom?
Here's what I do want to go back to. What were they accusing him of, or what were they going to catch him in the act of? I still am very confused on that.
I think they wanted to see if he would say, go ahead and ignore the law. In other words, because they knew Jesus to be a gracious and merciful person. That's his reputation. So we've got a guilty woman here, and if he tells us that she should not be punished, we got him. We got him in a direct contradiction of the law of Moses, and we'll work him over with that regards. So I think that's what they wanted. Yeah.
this is the case, if she actually did commit adultery, is because for one thing of that, I don't see why it would be wrong. I see your point too. But other thing too, he says, woman, you have, where's your accusers? And then he says, has no one condemned you? And then he says, neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more.
Yeah.
Why would Jesus say, I don't condemn you?
Hang on to that just one second, because that's really important, Thomas, really important. JD, do you have
I
another?
just said he couldn't condemn her. He wasn't an eyewitness.
That's the key there. That's the key. In other words, where are your accusers? And she said, well, they're not. And he said, neither do I accuse her. He wasn't in a position to accuse her. He didn't meet the conditions of the law. They didn't either, likely. And that's why they all left, being convicted in their conscience that they were doing a bad thing here. But Jesus was not in a position to condemn her. He certainly hadn't witnessed her sin.
But it seems
Now,
like
he knew, because he's deity, he knew whether she was guilty or not. And that probably goes to the expression, go and sin no more.
Yes, sin no more.
Yeah, because he knows her heart, right? But by the technical details of the law, he was not in a position to condemn her to stoning. Tom?
He's sort of, they're trying to bring a catch-22 situation. If he says let her go, well, that's a violation of the law. But if he says he condemns her, they say, well, where's the husband?
Yeah.
The law says.
They sort of had this set up, they could catch him coming or going.
And they've done that on several different occasions. Who's your neighbor? What's the greatest commandment? A lot of different things that they came through and presented and the way that Jesus takes and turns it around and asks the question back to them and things makes them think about the situation. Because when they came to him asking, what's the greatest commandment? And he said, well, what do you say it is? And,
Yeah, threw it back at them. Yeah.
So, having known the law, which they should have known,
And they did.
and they did.
Yeah, they did.
They wanted to play it their way.
Yeah. So Jesus, the key expression that, and Thomas was asking about this too. Neither do I condemn, verse 11, neither do I condemn. He can't. He's not technically in a position to be able to condemn her. Go and sin no more. So he knows her heart, and she knows that she is a sinner. He likely knows that if in fact she was guilty, he would know if she was in fact guilty of adultery. He would know that. He's not in a position to condemn her according to the law. Go and sin no more. I got that's a pretty also a pretty familiar phrase there. Go and sin no more. A number of years ago, I got a speeding ticket, and I was actually innocent. It was a clear case of mistaken identity. I was on the interstate, and cars were flying past me, and we went past the trooper, and he turned on his lights, came out and pulled me over. And I actually had not been speeding. And so I was just determined I wasn't going to pay that fine without at least contesting.
What they all say, Greg.
Say what?
They all say that.
Yeah, I know, we all say that. I had to go all the way to Springfield to go to the courthouse. And they had not pulled my summons out. The whole court was full of people with traffic violations, and I had to sit through there and listen to the whole bunch of them. And finally, the clerk came out and said, do you have your summons? And they had not pulled mine out. That's why I wasn't in the... So she went and got mine. And so I was the very last person to go before the judge. I'd been there for 2 or 3 hours. Everybody got a fine. And so I went up there, and the trooper was there. And he asked me to tell my side of the story. I told him I just think it's a clear case of mistaken identity. And officer, what are you saying here? He said, well, I saw Mr. Gwynn here driving at such and such speed in a white van. And I said, Your Honor, I don't have a white van. My van is green. The judge perked up and he says, what do you have to say about that, officer? And he's shuffling through his paper. He said, I do see it here. It is. His van was green. The judge said, now, we're going to have to let this one go. He said, Mr. Gwynn, go your way. He said, go and sin no more. He used that expression. And he's right. I've speeded, right? I have speeded. We've all speeded. We're not supposed to. We should try not to. But he used that phrase of Jesus. So Jesus is saying to the woman, go and sin no more. In general, go and sin no more. In specific, if you've been committing adultery, go and sin no more. And again, in his case, Jesus would have known this woman's heart and life perfectly, and so he could say that. Real quickly, last question. From this passage, what do we do when we find a friend or a brother in sin? So what would be your takeaway from this text that we've studied this morning? What would be your takeaway? How should we react? Anybody? Wayne?
Make sure you're righteous when you present evidence before somebody who is guilty of sin.
Yeah.
Make sure you've got all the facts and you follow what God says to do exactly.
Okay, so don't, it's the old expression, there's always two sides to a story, at least two sides to every story. So I should not, make sure I got all the information before I act upon it. I think that's a good rule. Anybody else? I think also, make sure about your own motives in the matter. In other words, so am I sort of rejoicing in the fact that I can go to this brother and rebuke them for sin? And what's my motivation? What am I doing here? So make sure of your own motivation. But certainly, there's nothing about this text that says ignore sin. So I got a brother and he's in sin. There's nothing about the text that says I should ignore it, look the other way. I should rebuke such people. I have a duty to do so. I should correct them. I certainly shouldn't just ignore sin. This text is not saying ignore sin in people's lives. This text is not saying that. And unfortunately, that's the way it often gets used. Any other thoughts there? All right. I think it's a valuable discussion. I think it's really important. Again, because it tells us what we should do, but we also have to be ready in regards to that text that is so often misused. All right, thanks everybody.